I didn't know my new house was hiding such disturbing secrets. My name is Claire Miller. I'm 29 years old, and I moved to Millbrook, New York, to start a new life. After a complicated divorce, the idea of starting over in a small town seemed ideal. The house I bought had everything I needed: history, charm, and an affordable price. But there was something no one mentioned. On the very first day, while exploring the rooms, I noticed a door in the ceiling of the second-floor hallway. It was small, with a rusty lock and scratch marks around it. I found it strange but decided to ignore it. Maybe it was just attic access, nothing more. At least that's what I thought. That night, while organizing my books in the living room, I heard a sound from upstairs. It was subtle, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe the house's old heating system. Later, when I went upstairs to my bedroom, I noticed something odd. The attic door, which I was certain had been closed, was now slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine. I tiptoed over and shut it, turning the lock firmly. "You're imagining things, Claire," I murmured to myself, trying to shake off the unease. But that night, I woke to the sound of something heavy being dragged again. This time, it seemed to come directly from the attic. The next day, I called the realtor who sold me the house, but he was evasive when I asked about the door. "It's just the attic," he said. "Probably old stuff up there, nothing to worry about." But there was something in his tone that left me unsettled, as if he knew more than he was letting on. Later, while walking around the neighborhood, I asked some residents about the house. Most avoided the topic, but an older woman who introduced herself as Edna gave me some answers. "That house used to belong to Margaret Blackwood," she said, lowering her voice. "She disappeared years ago and no one ever found out what happened. Some say she was different." "Different how?" I asked, intrigued. Edna hesitated, glancing around before continuing. "They say she performed rituals. Strange things in the attic. I've never been inside, but I've heard stories. If I were you, I'd stay away from that place." When I returned home, the attic door seemed to stare at me like a challenge. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but something about that door deeply unsettled me. I grabbed some tools and decided to open it. After much effort, I broke the rusty lock. A folding ladder dropped down from the ceiling, revealing the entrance to the attic. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a small, dusty space. I climbed up slowly, and the smell of mold and something metallic, maybe dried blood, filled my nose. The attic was full of old boxes, and in the center was a rocking chair. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn with something that looked like red paint, but seemed disturbingly fresh. Around the room, old porcelain dolls were arranged on shelves, all with expressions of frozen terror on their faces. The rocking chair had something carved into its wood. "Always watch." My heart raced. As I stepped back, I tripped over something on the floor, a piece of broken mirror. Holding it up, I noticed the doll's eyes reflected in the surface, but something was off. They weren't looking in the same direction as in reality. It was as if they had moved. I hurriedly climbed down from the attic and locked the door again. I decided I needed to get rid of those things as soon as possible. The next day, I took the dolls and the chair outside and left them on the curb to be picked up by the garbage truck. But when I woke up, I heard the sound of the rocking chair creaking again. I went to the attic, my heart pounding. All the dolls were back on the shelves. The chair was exactly where I had found it, rocking gently as if something invisible was sitting on it. In the silence of the room, I heard a low, childlike giggle. I wasn't alone. I knew something was wrong with that house. From the moment I found the attic, it felt like the energy around me had shifted. The dolls, the rocking chair, and the symbols on the walls. It was all part of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. But now, I had no choice. The next morning, while cleaning the living room, I noticed something strange. The dolls, which I had only seen in the attic, were now scattered across different rooms in the house. One was in the kitchen, another in my bedroom, and a third on the porch. They all seemed to be staring directly at me, as if they were watching. I needed answers. I decided to go back to the attic, but this time I was prepared. I grabbed a flashlight and a screwdriver for protection, though I had no idea what I'd be facing. When I opened the attic door, the coldness was even more intense than before. The air felt heavier, as if I were wading through icy water. I climbed the steps slowly, and the beam of the flashlight lit up the walls. The symbols had changed. Now they seemed to move, as if alive. In the center of the attic, the rocking chair was still, but something new had appeared. Beneath it, the floor was scratched with circular marks. It looked like some sort of altar. That's when I saw the diary. Under a loose floorboard, I found an old notebook, its cover worn and its pages yellowed. I opened it carefully, and Margaret Blackwood's words began to tell her story. She had lost her young son Samuel in a horrific accident. Devastated by grief, she spent years studying forbidden rituals, believing she could bring him back. The attic was her altar, and the dolls were vessels for lost souls. Margaret believed that if she completed the ritual, she could resurrect Samuel. But something went wrong. Her final notes were confused with phrases like, "They're not him," and "The door is open, but I can't close it." As I finished reading, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around quickly, but no one was there. Just the dolls, still on the shelves, seemed to stare at me with greater intensity. The rocking chair began to creak on its own, swaying back and forth. Suddenly, a shadow took form in the corner of the attic. It was tall, with vaguely human contours, but distorted. Two glowing eyes stared at me, and then I heard the voice. "You've opened the door again." It was a feminine voice, but distorted, as if several people were speaking at once. "Margaret?" I asked, trying not to show fear. The shadow moved closer, and then I saw her. Margaret Blackwood, or what was left of her. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, but there was something hauntingly human in her expression. "Complete the ritual," she commanded. "Bring him back." I knew she was talking about Samuel, the altar, the dolls. It was all part of her plan to finish what she had started. "I won't do it," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Margaret advanced, and the attic began to tremble. The dolls fell from the shelves, and the rocking chair toppled over on its own. "You don't have a choice," she said. "The door is open, and something must pass through it." The floor began to crack, and a red light emerged from the fissures. The air grew heavy, and I could barely breathe. I grabbed the diary and ran for the exit, but the attic door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I knew what I had to do. I threw the diary onto the altar and used the flashlight to set it on fire. Margaret screamed, a deafening sound that pierced my ears. The dolls began to melt, and Margaret's shadow twisted as if it were being torn apart. "You don't understand," she murmured as she faded. "Now you're marked." When the diary turned to ash, the attic fell silent. The red light vanished, and the door swung open. I ran downstairs, grabbed my things, and left the house that very night. I never went back, but something tells me I didn't truly escape. Weeks later, I found one of the dolls in the back seat of my car. On its base, a phrase was etched: "She always watches." I've always been drawn to places no one else dared to explore. My name is Evan Carter, and when my friends mentioned the abandoned junkyard on the outskirts of Phoenix, I immediately agreed to check it out. It seemed like the perfect spot for an adventure. At least, that's what we thought. That evening, we drove to the site as the sun dipped below the horizon. I was in the car with Taylor Green, my boldest friend, who always had a wild idea up her sleeve. In the back seat were Mason Lewis, the group's joker, and Sophie Ramirez, the quietest but also the most sensitive to things others didn't notice. When we arrived, the junkyard was far more intimidating than I had imagined. Cars were stacked into precarious towers, and shards of metal littered the ground. A rusty gate creaked in the wind, producing an eerie, high-pitched sound. At the center of the junkyard stood a small shed, partially collapsed, with loose shingles and broken doors. "Think we'll find anything cool?" Taylor asked, laughing. "Probably just a tetanus shot," Mason quipped, kicking a pile of rusty bolts. But Sophie stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the shadows between the cars, as if expecting something to emerge. We entered the junkyard with our flashlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating the rusted debris. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of metal shifting in the wind. At the heart of the junkyard, we found something unexpected, an improvised altar. It was made of welded scrap metal, surrounded by extinguished candles and strange symbols etched into metal plates. Animal bones were carefully arranged around it, and on top of the altar lay a piece of metal inscribed with an unfamiliar language. "What kind of people do something like this?" Mason asked, trying to mask his unease with humor. "A cult," Sophie replied in a low voice, "and from the looks of it, they left something unfinished." "Don't say that," I retorted, but my curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the metal piece from the altar, feeling its cold weight in my hands. The inscription seemed ancient, and for a moment, a strange chill ran down my spine. Taylor stepped closer. "Maybe you should put that back, Evan." "It's just a piece of metal," I replied. But as soon as I placed it back on the altar, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No more creaking metal or rustling leaves. It was as if the entire junkyard was holding its breath. "This isn't normal," Sophie whispered, her wide eyes scanning the surroundings. And then we heard it. A deep sound, like metal dragging across the ground, echoed through the junkyard. It was slow and heavy, coming from everywhere at once. I tried to stay calm, but the noise persisted, growing closer. I pointed my flashlight at a nearby stack of cars and saw something that made my heart stop. The shadows were moving. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but it wasn't. A tall, shapeless shadow glided between the cars, watching us without getting closer. "What is that?" Taylor asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the stacks of cars began to groan. Pieces of metal clattered to the ground, as if something was deliberately shifting them. We ran toward the exit, but the path was unrecognizable. The stacks of junk had rearranged themselves into a labyrinth that hadn't been there before. "This can't be happening," Mason shouted. "We just came through here." The sound of dragging metal grew louder. Then we heard footsteps, slow and heavy, like someone walking in iron boots. "Something's surrounding us," Sophie said, gripping my arm tightly. "It's not human." We tried to find a way out, but every path led us back to the altar. Shadows danced around us, and low metallic laughter echoed through the air. When we returned to the altar, we saw something new. At its peak was a figure made of metal, shaped almost like a human, but grotesque. Its eyes glowed faintly red, and the thing seemed to be breathing, as if alive. "You've opened the door," a deep voice said, echoing through the junkyard. "And now I am free." I looked at my friends, and the terror in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. There was no escape. The sound of metallic footsteps seemed to draw closer with every passing second. It felt as though the junkyard itself was alive, surrounding us and guiding us straight into the grasp of whatever I had unleashed. "What the hell is happening?" Mason shouted, his flashlight shaking in his hands. "This isn't real." "It's real," Sophie replied, her voice low and trembling with fear. "And it won't let us leave." The figure on the altar began to move. Its grotesque form, made of molten, shifting metal, seemed to melt and reform with every step. Two eyes glowed a fierce red, and a deep, muffled laugh reverberated through the air. "You opened the door," the voice said. "Now someone must stay." "Stay?" Taylor asked, backing away. "What does that mean?" The figure advanced slowly, pointing a sharp metallic claw toward us. "A sacrifice, a soul to replace mine." We tried to run, but the stacks of cars shifted as if alive, blocking our paths. Running through the labyrinth was futile. Every exit we found seemed to vanish before our eyes. "Evan, you touched the altar," Sophie said, her desperate eyes locking onto mine. "This is your fault." She was right, but I didn't know how to fix it. As we stumbled through the maze, I remembered the inscriptions on the metal piece I had picked up from the altar. Pulling it from my pocket, I stared at the strange, faintly glowing marks. "What does it say?" Taylor asked, her panic barely contained. "I have no idea," I admitted. Sophie grabbed the object and studied the inscriptions. "It's a ritual," she said. If we complete it, maybe we can trap it again. We found temporary refuge in the shed at the center of the junkyard. While Sophie frantically worked to decipher the ritual, the sound of grinding metal grew louder. The air felt heavier, pressing in on us. "He's coming," Mason muttered, peeking through a crack in the door. Outside, the grotesque figure moved steadily closer. The ground trembled beneath its steps, and the shadows around it writhed like living arms reaching toward us. Finally, Sophie figured out the ritual. We had to recreate the symbols on the altar using pieces of metal and our own blood. "Will this work?" I asked, clutching a shard of metal with trembling hands. "It'll either work or we'll die," Sophie replied grimly. We returned to the altar cautiously, the entity trailing us. Taylor began sketching the symbols with the metal shards while Mason and I cut our hands, using our blood to draw as instructed. The air grew heavier and the metallic figure paused, watching us intently. "You think you can imprison me again?" the voice boomed, resonating inside our heads. "You are weak." The altar began to glow faintly, and the figure suddenly charged at us with terrifying speed. "Finish the ritual," I yelled, holding up a shard of metal in a feeble attempt to block its path. But it was too late. Azrael, as Sophie had named it, lunged at Mason. He screamed in agony as the metal around him seemed to fuse with the creature's shifting form. "It's taking me," Mason shouted, panic overtaking him. That's when Sophie came up with a desperate idea. "Azrael wants a sacrifice," she said. "If it thinks it's already claimed one, we might have enough time to finish." Before we could stop her, Sophie threw herself onto the altar, screaming at Azrael. "Here's your soul!" The entity hesitated, as if trying to comprehend her actions. We seized the moment to finish the symbols, using every drop of blood we had left. The altar's glow intensified, and Azrael let out a deafening, guttural scream as its metallic form began to disintegrate. The shadows that surrounded it dissolved, and the junkyard fell into an eerie silence. When it was over, Sophie lay unconscious on the ground but alive. Mason was covered in cuts and bruises but seemed okay. The altar, however, still emitted a faint glow, as if waiting for another chance to be activated. "Let's get out of here," Taylor said, helping Sophie to her feet. We left the junkyard that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. Weeks later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a piece of metal engraved with the same inscriptions from the altar and a single chilling phrase: "I will return." My grandfather, Jack Donovan, was the most skeptical man I ever knew. He didn't believe in ghost stories, had no patience for superstitions, and always told me that everything in the world had a logical explanation. That's why, when he told me about what happened at the Empire Cinema in Illinois, I believed him. He would never share something like this if it weren't true. "Nathan," he began one evening, looking at me with a grave expression, "this story isn't to scare you, it's to warn you. There are places that should never be revisited." At the time I was a teenager and I loved hearing his tales. But this one was different. It was darker, more real. It all happened in the late 1950s when my grandfather was 19. He lived in a small town near Springfield, Illinois, and, like any young man, loved hanging out with his friends. Back then, the Empire Cinema was a local legend. It had been closed since the end of World War II and was known for its grand architecture, and rumors of something strange happening during its last screening. Jack and his friends, Tom, Eddie, and Marianne, received mysterious invitations to a special screening. The invitation read, "A final screening of The Door to Eternity. Come and witness an experience that transcends cinema." They didn't know who had sent the invitations, but their curiosity got the better of them. "It was just a movie, right?" my grandfather said. "What could go wrong?" On the night of the screening, they arrived at the Empire Cinema. The place was magnificent, even in its state of decay. Dusty chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the walls were covered in peeling layers of paint. The box office was empty, but the doors were open, as though the cinema had been waiting for them. The atmosphere was strange, my grandfather described. There was something in the air, like time itself was trapped in that place. Inside, they found other people, no more than 15 in total. The other attendees were quiet, their expressions distant, as if they were there against their will. Jack found it odd, but didn't think much of it. The lights dimmed, and the screen lit up with the image of a black and white film. It was titled The Door to Eternity. The movie followed a story about a secluded mansion and a family dealing with unexplainable events. It was dark, but not unlike other films of the era. Then something changed. As they watched, Jack noticed that the characters in the film began behaving strangely. They started looking directly at the camera, directly at the audience. At first, it seemed like an unusual artistic choice. But then one of the characters, a woman in a white dress, pointed toward the audience. Jack felt as if she was staring straight at him, and it wasn't just him. Marianne gripped his arm, whispering, "They're looking at us, Jack." Murmurs began spreading among the audience, and some tried to leave, but the doors were locked. The woman in the film took a step forward, out of the screen. Panic erupted in the theater. The woman walked between the rows of seats, her footsteps making no sound. Jack tried to stand, but it felt like his body was paralyzed. He glanced at Tom, who whispered, "This can't be. This isn't real." But it was real. One of the audience members, seated near the aisle, screamed as the woman placed her hand on his shoulder. He began to convulse as though being pulled into something invisible. On the screen, the image changed. The man was now in the film, staring at the audience with wide eyes and an open mouth, frozen in a silent scream. "I was frozen," my grandfather told me. "I didn't know what to do. There was no way out, and that thing was hunting us." He tried to stay calm and observe what was happening. That's when he noticed something odd in the projection booth. A bright light was flickering inside, like a malfunctioning projector. He had an idea. If he could get to the booth, maybe he could shut it off and stop whatever was happening. "It was my only shot," he said. But the path to the projection booth was filled with shadows that seemed to come alive. Jack knew that to escape, he would have to confront whatever the cinema was projecting, both on the screen and beyond it. My grandfather said he had never felt as much fear as he did that night at the Empire Cinema. As the characters from the film stepped out of the screen, each of their movements made the impossible seem real. He knew he had to reach the projection booth, but the path there grew more treacherous with every step. "That place was alive, Nathan," he told me, staring straight into my eyes. "It was as if the cinema itself knew I wanted to escape and was doing everything it could to trap me." As Jack and his friends tried to plan their escape, another of the audience members began to scream. He was being pulled toward the screen, his legs already engulfed by the projector's light. Jack watched in horror as the man vanished, only to reappear in the film as another character, now a part of the cursed mansion. "I knew that if I stayed still, the same thing would happen to me," Jack said. Jack convinced his friends to head toward the projection booth, but the cinema reacted. The seats groaned, and the shadows on the walls began to move, stretching like arms reaching out to grab them. Tom tripped and nearly got caught, but Jack managed to pull him up at the last second. When they finally reached the staircase leading to the booth, Jack felt something was wrong. The light from the projector was now blindingly bright and emitted a pulsating sound like a heartbeat. "I felt like the entire cinema was watching me," he said. Every step felt like a test. Halfway there, Jack noticed Marianne had stopped. She was staring at the screen, mesmerized. "They're calling me," she said, her voice low and distant. Jack tried to pull her away, but it was as if she were glued to the floor. Suddenly, the woman in the white dress appeared behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Jack shouted for her to run, but it was too late. Marianne was dragged into the screen, her screams echoing through the theater. On the screen, Jack saw her standing at one of the mansion's windows, pounding on the glass as if pleading for help. Finally, Jack and the two remaining friends reached the projection booth. Inside, they found an old projector emitting the pulsating light. On top of the machine sat a film reel labeled "The Door to Eternity." "Destroy it!" Tom yelled. But when Jack tried to touch the reel, the light seared his hand. At that moment, a voice echoed through the booth. "You cannot leave. You are already part of the story." The room began to shake, and the figure from the film appeared on the other side of the booth's glass, staring directly at them. It seemed to grow larger, its face filling the window, a blur of shadows and hollow eyes. Jack realized the projector was the key. If he could shut it down, he might be able to stop the film and escape. But the machine seemed to be protected by an invisible force. "I had to risk everything," he said. He grabbed a chair and smashed the projector's glass. The moment it shattered, the light flickered violently and the sound of the film cut off. The theater was plunged into an eerie silence, followed by a deafening scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows on the walls disintegrated, and the characters who had emerged from the screen froze in place before vanishing. Jack and his friends ran for the exit, which was finally unlocked. As they stumbled outside, the first rays of sunlight began to appear, and the Empire Cinema was eerily silent. My grandfather said that while he had escaped, he never truly felt free. "That place marked me, Nathan," he said, "and I never understood why." Years later, while helping him organize his belongings, I found a box of old keepsakes. Inside was a small strip of film. When I held it up to the light, my blood ran cold. It was an image of my grandfather as a young man, staring back at me from the film strip. Behind him, the woman in the white dress stood, smiling.